So hello everyone and welcome to the Psychoanalysis and Politics seminar. And the title is Why Decolonization and Freedom of Speech Means Feminine Law. And I'll tell you this is, first the idea was that I would give a talk, but then the two of them, GENTILE and BARNABY BARRATT, had the idea of doing it as a dialogue between them. That's a great idea. So this, I'm showing you Jill's book, and she's a faculty member at the NIU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And her book here, Feminine Law, Freud, Free Speech, and the Voice of the Sire, with Michael McCroner, explores the mutual resonances between psychoanalysis and democracy through the lenses of freedom of speech and the feminine. I think the themes in this book will be at the focus of this conversation today. And I also got, I can show you, BARNABY BARRATT, who's a training analyst in the South African Psychoanalytic Association and is also a supervising analyst of the Indian Psychoanalytic Society. And he is the author of a trilogy called Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. And this one is the third one that I got here, called Beyond Psychotherapy on Becoming a Radical Psychoanalyst. I think the two of them, they got some themes in common, with free association and freedom of speech. So it's going to be really interesting to hear the dialogue between the two. Yes, so perhaps you'd just like to start.
Shall we just launch ourselves then?
Yeah, great.
As I understand it, I'm tasked with chairing Jill, which is a formidable task, and also sort of having a conversation with her. And I'd like to say just personally how nice it is to see so many familiar faces and faces that are becoming familiar. Jonathan, it's lovely to see you again. And Dr. Malone, our paths keep nearly crossing, but not quite. And Professor Miller, I know it's very nice that this is a group that is growing, for me at least, in familiarity. So I thought I would start by sort of having the chutzpah to locate Jill by giving a sort of a synoptic and highly tendentious history of the conversation or the non-conversation between feminism and queer studies, and in a way subaltern studies as well, and liberation studies and psychoanalysis. But to focus for a minute on the feminist and the queer part of it, it seems to me very interesting that the 1905 book, which Freud said was one of only two books that he thought would have lasting merit, actually has incredible radical potential for feminist and queer thinking and liberatory thinking that in a way has not been exploited. The proposition that is implicit in it, that we're all bisexual, and the proposition implicit in it that we're all queer, is actually really quite emancipatory, that has been largely ignored. What has been focused on in a way is the fact that it was a radical critique of Kraepelinian psychiatry and a radical critique of Krafft-Ebing's sexology, which had been published just, I think, 8 years previously. And in a way, what had happened, I think, historically, was that the focus lay on the 1920 papers, and the 1920 papers that were in many ways disastrous. Disastrous in a way because of their erroneous anatomy, for which Freud cannot be blamed. Disastrous in a way because of their oculocentric epistemology, in terms of de-emphasizing the sensuality of the developing child. Disastrous in a way for all sorts of assumptions implicit in them, for much of which Freud could not be, I think, blamed. But the focus of the psychoanalytic movement was on these series of papers. And the focus of feminist critique was on the error of those papers. And so there was a period of time, and in a way, the dialogue or lack of dialogue between feminism and psychoanalysis has undergone phases, rather like the first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave of feminist theorizing. But there began, I think, to be a pushback against some of the assumptions of the 1920 papers. While by and large, and those of you who, like me, are card-carrying members of the International Psychoanalytic Association may want to push back on this, but by and large, there was an almost slavish adherence to some of the precepts of the 1920 series of papers, precepts that clearly need to be contested and gradually were contested by feminist and queer thinkers. The next sort of wave, it seemed to me, in this dialogue was rather akin to the second wave of feminist theorizing, which was in very sort of patchy and dispersed pushback consisting of the assertion of feminine values, the assertion of feminine values and feminine ethics as somehow equal and opposite to masculinist discourse, or even superior and opposite to masculinist discourse. And I'm thinking here perhaps of people like Karen Horney, all the way through to Carol Gilligan, for example, who was my mentor at one time, and that sort of genre of feminist thinking. Then what has arisen, it seems to me, which is extremely important, and really in a way is a post-Lacanian development, is the idea that one looks at masculinist, phallocratic, phallocentric discourse, and that one tries to engage in a critique of it. And that this critique is largely, in the last 20 years, what has preoccupied feminist writing that has engaged with psychoanalysis. You think of people like Jane Gallup and many, many others, probably too numerous for us to list. The important thing, it seems to me, that locates Jill as, I think, in my view, one of the most advanced thinkers in this conversation, is the idea that there might be not just discourse that is other than the discourse that is phallocratic, but there might be a mode of discourse within the phallocratic, animating the phallocratic, that takes us beyond the binary of masculine, feminine, and that in some way infuses the phallocratic thinking and at the same time gives birth to it and at the same time constitutes its critique. And here I think Jill emerges for me as one of the more interesting exponents of a line of thinking that would include people like Luce Irigaray and her thinking in her early works on the vaginality of discourse. Would include obviously people like Julia Kristeva with her Platonic emphasis on the hora as the sort of substrate of phallocratic discourse. And this is a different mode of critique. And it seems to me that Jill's book and Jill's series of papers on the vaginality of thinking takes us beyond the binaries and the problematic of critique that is constituted within discourse that still observes a certain sort of binarism between the masculine and the feminine. It is in a way, as I tried to write in my 2017 paper in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, it is in a way of thinking, it is something otherwise. It is a mode otherwise than the constitution of discourse around the phallus and around the hierarchies of domination and subjugation that stem therefrom it. So I'm really delighted to be the one to be invited to start Jill off, which is what I think I'm tasked to do. So I wonder, Jill, if you'd like to start by saying more, drawing now from your abstract, by saying more about what it means or what it would mean for the discipline of psychoanalysis to subject itself to a post-colonial critique. I think post-colonial is an idea that has entered your writings subsequent to your book, but I'm not clear about that. An anti-phallocentric critique, maybe a critique that appeals or evokes some sort of indigenous or indigeneity, as you also say in your abstract. What would it mean for psychoanalysis to subject itself to that sort of critique of its own discourse? You do have to turn your microphone on.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Lenny, for inviting me and us, and all of you for attending today. You know, I want to acknowledge that here in the US, tomorrow is the Thanksgiving holiday, so our holiday of thanks, and gratitude for our forebears and for our land and its abundant gifts, and a holiday that perpetuates the assaults of coloniality, its erasures and appropriations. And so this contradiction that is right here in this moment that we'll be speaking about today feels like a backdrop for today's talk. And so lately I've been influenced by Charles Eisenstein and his notions of the sacred economy of the gift. And I feel like it's a gift to be here with you today, and certainly to have this opportunity for an admittedly tilted dialogue between Barnaby and me, as the dialogue is centering on my ideas. But his own robust, amazing thinking about free association and the notion of opening up to a conversation that is so elusive but opens to an otherwise beyond the conventional order of patriarchy is at this point has thoroughly infiltrated my own thinking. So talk about assimilative practices, maybe we can look at some of the differences also.